Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Healing Outside the Box. My name is Gene Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Now this is episode 267, and I'm calling it How to Change Recipes to Fit Your Nutritional Needs. Now this particular episode might have some sciencey material for people who are on special diets. So before we go any further, I should probably tell you that I was traditionally trained in the nutrition field before branching out into what we might call the preventative care arena, which basically means that in school, I had a traditional degree in nutritional biochemistry and another one in food science. During the summers, during my school years, I worked as a lab tech in nutrition labs doing animal studies. In my first lab tech job, I worked in a nutrition pathology lab for a professor who was looking into whether or not certain food additives may cause cancer. There I was working with laboratory rats. Yes, and I found it very exciting. And the food additive was an enzyme called lactase that is added to milk to make lactate milk. Now, the second summer job was in a biochemistry lab, working for a professor who was doing test tube studies, primarily on whether or not vitamin A or beta-carotene in its plant form slowed down or stopped the growth of cancer cells. So that was the area of focus that my schoolwork brought me to. After school, out of the starting gate, I became a registered dietitian, again mainstream, and worked in the inpatient and outpatient hospital settings. During that time, I worked for a group of cardiologists, and I saw a lot of people with heart disease and diabetes. I realized, as many others in the business realized, that what we were doing just wasn't working, and it was no better for those wanting to lose weight. At the time, I remember reading something that said there was a 3% success rate with weight loss diets that the mainstream nutrition community was recommending. Long story short, for so many complicated reasons, it just ain't working. Even back in the 80s and 90s, we estimated that almost 1/3 of patients admitted to the hospital were sick because of some chronic condition related to diet and lifestyle. It was a cardiac floor, a diabetes floor, a stroke floor, a kidney dialysis unit full of diabetics, and eating disorders patients on the pediatric and psych units. That led myself and so many others to start thinking about preventative nutrition education, almost as a second field of study. About this time, my neuromuscular disease, which was at the time a general muscular dystrophy of unknown type, started to get worse and take hold of my lifestyle. It forced me to realize that I can no longer go out to work and come home like most regular folks. This may be in the TMI category, but that hasn't stopped me before, so I'll tell you what happened. One day, while at the cardiologist's office that I was working at, I went to the ladies' room and then couldn't get up off of the toilet. Luckily, I thought to keep the door unlocked in case something happened to me. Otherwise, they would have been taking down the door to get me out. So I went home that night to seriously think about what I could possibly do next. In other words, reinventing myself. A little like what we're doing now in this country. My journey took me down the path of a virtual nutritionist, I guess that's what the kids call it now, and a health and wellness coach. And since I've had some experience in the nutrition research field, I thought I would start a podcast with its aim to regurgitate the technical nutrition research into a more approachable format. In other words, how do we translate the ever-evolving information about nutrition and health into what we can eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Okay, that's the background. Over the past few episodes, I have dabbled in how we put theory into practice during these crazy times that we live in. In Cooking as a Mindfulness Exercise, which is episode 264, I get into how we can kill two birds with one stone. I have to find another analogy that is not hurting any of our lovely feathered friends. I'll check Ted Lasso's quotes for one from him. By the way, if you're not listening to Ted Lasso, you're missing out on some laughing out loud. Anyway, when we cook, I think we can see it as a time to be with our family and get creative, while also doing something for our bodies and saving money on our prepaid cash cards, as the youngsters like to say. We can eat healthier and cheaper when we make it ourselves. That was episode 264. In 265, I talked about making a plan to get there. Today, I want to talk about looking at a recipe, say on the internet, and changing it a bit according to your preferences and dietary needs. So I looked around, and I realized that I had done a previous episode on how to make a recipe our own. I have made a few minor adjustments to the episode to update it, but basically I decided that cooking yummy and healthy food at home is timeless. So here is a slightly altered version of a previous episode. Enjoy. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to Healing Outside the Box. My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. This is episode 183, and I'm calling it How to Make a Recipe Your Own. Now, I have to tell you that I was outside in my garden yesterday, and I noticed something quite bizarre. There were button mushrooms growing in my garden, right next to my dahlias, right out of the ground. Not around a tree or any such thing. I live a block from the ocean, so there's not a lot of wooded area around here. We do have one tree, but that's it. Then I looked around our property and saw mushrooms growing on the side of the brick building, and that area normally gets a lot of sun. This is the first time in my life I've ever seen mushrooms in my flower garden. I want to round up the usual suspects, which is always Monsanto and, more specifically, Roundup. See episode 181. But I think it's more complicated than that. We have our climate change, our environmental chemicals, our mushrooms growing next to petunias, and now my cat Betty has a plastic fetish. Look it up, it's a real thing. Woe is me. I'm going to need one of those sandwich board signs. Maybe I can string it around my wheelchair, saying, "The end is near." Thank God we have a perfectly stable political situation in this country. Anyway, I'm here today to tell you what you can do with your zucchini, and I mean that only in the nicest possible way. But first, I wanted to bring to your attention a couple of YouTube videos. The first video is a TED Talk by a guy that they call the guerrilla gardener. His name is Ron Tinley, and he's very inspiring. Even if you don't want to do vegetable gardening in your own community, you should listen to him just for some inspiration in general. I'll give you a link in the show notes to this particular video, but you can also just go to YouTube and type in Ron Tinley. That's R-O-N, last name F-I-N-L-E-Y. I get so excited when I see guys like Ron taking the reins and leading us to where we need to go. And where we need to go is more local farming, community gardens, and schoolyard vegetable gardens. The second video is another TED Talk by Jamie Oliver. You may have seen Jamie Oliver promoting his nutrition education for school children somewhere else, but this TED Talk brings it all home. He first goes into the huge cost of our obesity epidemic, especially in young people. And the cost is obviously in suffering as well as dollars. And then he suggests how we can begin to tackle this problem. He says we need to start teaching our kids in school about growing their own food, cooking their own food, and perhaps eating that food in the schools instead of the crap they are now getting. He also makes the suggestion that I've been flapping my gums about for years, and it's this. We need to start cooking lessons in school and educate every child in every school, not just a few wealthy children in Brooklyn. Again, I will give you the link in the show notes, but you can just go to YouTube and search Jamie Oliver TED Talk. I also have an update on Dwayne Johnson and the court battle that he's having with Monsanto. I'll give you a link to this article in the show notes, but you can also Google Dwayne Johnson and Monsanto. Back in 2018, Dwayne Johnson, who was a groundskeeper working on the school grounds in California, was employed spraying Roundup to get rid of the dandelions in the schoolyard. He came down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a very serious case. He sued Monsanto and won the case. Monsanto was ordered to pay out $20 million to Dwayne Johnson for getting him non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from the Roundup on the school grounds. Proving cause and effect is always tricky in these situations, but Mr. Johnson won, and since then, glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, has been declared a probable carcinogen by the CDC and the World Health Organization, or WHO. He ultimately had no choice in being exposed to what we now know is a carcinogen. The 2021 update on our friend Dwayne Johnson is that, unbelievably, he is still alive. I have to wonder if the disposable income he was awarded may have helped with his health care. This brings to light the evidence linking Monsanto's Roundup to cancers. The point that they're trying to make is that he is not the only person dying because Roundup is being sprayed in many schools just to kill dandelions. And, oh yeah, exposure to Roundup causes cancer. Now, back to the episode. Let's discuss how you can switch ingredients to make a recipe according to what you like to eat and how you like to eat it. If you want to replace an ingredient, you first need the why. In other words, you may want to stay away from grains that have gluten. Or 2, you may be allergic to a specific ingredient, say strawberries, or just have an adverse reaction to it. You may be on Coumadin and need to stay away from foods that are rich in vitamin K. And that would be your spinach, kale, Brussels sprouts type vegetables. 3, you may want to substitute an item that has a lot of saturated fat. 4, you may want to substitute an item that has a lot of sugar. Or 5, you might just not like a particular ingredient and you prefer another. Okay, first let's talk about gluten in wheat flour, since everybody seems to be talking about it. There are lots of flour substitutes out there. You could use oat flour, rice flour, sprouted corn flour, but make sure you get the organic when it comes to corn. An example might be Ezekiel bread. That is actually made from a sprouted corn flour. You also have almond flour, chickpea flour, and, believe it or not, coconut flour. They're all gluten-free. You don't necessarily have to go to Whole Foods, though. There's a couple of supermarket brands that you can get. Now, I don't have any particular financial attachment to any of these brands. I'm just going to list them. King Arthur brand has a gluten-free flour that's actually a blend, and it can be found anywhere. It's white rice, brown rice, tapioca starch, and potato starch. Arrowhead and Bob's Red Mill brands also have alternatives to the gluten-free flour. In addition, I believe all 3 have a sprouted grain flour that has a lower gluten content but will rise for you. You can substitute cornmeal for flour, but remember that the cornmeal will not rise. You may have to add another flour to blend in. If you're wondering about measurements for any of these, feel free to email me with a question about it, and I'll look into it and email you back. You can email me in the comments section, or you could email me from my contact page, which is on my website called, not surprisingly, healingoutsidethebox.com. When it comes to the substitute flours, I like oat flour because it has a high protein content and lots of soluble fiber. You need about 1.5 cups oat flour for every cup of white flour. If you're making something like apple crisp, you can also replace rolled oats for the flour. As for breadcrumbs, if you're making, say, meatballs or meatloaf, you can try rolled oats or a crushed oat cereal. If you don't have a gluten intolerance, you can always do a half white, half wheat. and you don't have to change the other ingredients. If a recipe calls for you to thicken with flour and you want gluten-free, you can use a little cornstarch, but only use half of the amount recommended. Now, if you are a paleo person and want to substitute for breadcrumbs, you can always substitute with coconut and coat your chicken with that. When it comes to specific food allergies, I don't want to get too involved in details because you should be talking to a health professional about specific allergies. In general, you can simply substitute a similar item with a similar water content. But you can email me as well with general questions about allergies. Now, when you're reducing the fat in a recipe, people usually go with fruit or fruit juices or purees. When people use fruit, they generally use apples. But I don't find that apples impart a lot of flavor, and a peeled apple has essentially no nutritional value. If you're replacing apples or applesauce, you'll need a fruit with some liquid. A plum puree might be cool, or dates that you can throw into the processor, or pumpkin puree. You get the picture. You'll need something that adds moisture. If you want to specifically stay away from saturated fat, like butter, the most common substitute we recommend is olive oil. It's generally 3/4 cup of olive oil to every cup of butter. If you don't want to memorize that, just think that you'll need a little less of the olive oil. Now, when it comes to dairy in general, you can use the rule of thumb that substituting low fat for the full fat product will often work. If a soup calls for, say, heavy cream, and you want the thickening that a cream soup will give you, you can try a low fat version, say skimmed evaporated milk or sour cream. Or you could make a roux with olive oil instead of butter, and then thicken it up and add cow's milk or coconut milk or oat milk, whatever works for you. By the way, if you're making a roux and you're using olive oil instead of butter, you can make it the same way. In other words, the 1-to-1 ratio. 1 tablespoon or maybe 1.5 tablespoons of olive oil and 1 tablespoon of flour. Stir it continuously, and then add the milk and continue stirring. When you add the milk, you might want to lower the heat. Now, if you're doing a vegan soup, I would suggest using a vegetable puree. Cauliflower puree is very popular, or a potato puree, or a carrot puree. And the reason those are popular is because they're mild. Using something like split peas will make the whole recipe taste like peas. Now, eggs. For every 1 egg, you can substitute 1/4 cup egg substitute or 2 egg whites. That will work for almost anything. Now, another source of fat that is seldom recognized is salad dressings. Now, with salad dressings, you may want to stay away from the heavy, creamy this or creamy that. A lower calorie salad dressing might be something like poppy seed dressing or raspberry vinaigrette. In the latter, you may want to watch the added sugar if you're a diabetic. If you want something fancy, like a tahini dressing, you can normally find that in the produce section of the supermarket. Now, bacon. I know, I'm going after the bacon. You can always substitute Canadian bacon or a smoked turkey. And no, it's not bacon, but that's a good thing. Okay, so you're getting the basic idea for foods other than vegetables. But I want to talk to you about vegetables because it is, after all, July and lots of great vegetables are plentiful. Except if you live in Argentina or Brazil. In that case, you may want to find a substitute for all of the beef that you guys are grazing on down there. Or is it up there if I turn around? Anyway, let's talk about vegetables. Here is what I want to say. If you don't like broccoli, don't eat it for goodness sake. There's only about 100 substitutions in your grocery store. Again, if you're cooking, you can substitute vegetables by similar water content, nutrients, or cooking method. Let's say you're making a spinach lasagna, and you're not crazy about spinach. Because spinach gives off a lot of water, you may want to substitute with, say, zucchini. You can substitute with mushrooms as well. When you don't want moisture, then the opposite is true. If you're cooking, say, an omelet or quiche, you may want to be aware of the watery vegetables because they will make your final product a little watery. To get around this, you can always saute in advance. Onions and peppers won't make much of a difference because they won't add a lot of water to the finished product. The same goes for pizza. Peppers and onions are popular toppings because they don't make the pizza too soggy. You could substitute artichoke hearts, broccoli, or already sauteed mushrooms. Zucchini won't work because it gets too watery. If you've got specific questions, feel free to contact me on my contact page, and I'll get back to you with an answer. You can also send me a recipe that you want fixed, and I'll fix it for you. You can email me with the recipe you want to alter, and tell me what you like, and I'll fix the liquid to solid ratio for you. Okay, now say you're substituting food ingredients and you want to keep the same nutrients. So you may want to substitute protein for protein. For example, if you don't like lima beans and fava beans conjures up visions of Silence of the Lambs, you can always substitute a similar bean, like a kidney bean, a red bean, or a cannellini bean. They all have about the same amount of protein, fiber, and vitamins. When it comes to vitamins in particular, I'll often mention them in color groups. In other words, the red, orange, yellow vegetables have a lot of vitamin A and C. So if you're cooking a stir-fry dish, you can substitute almost any red, orange, yellow for another red, orange, yellow. The dark greens are rich in the B vitamins and also have some iron, potassium, and other minerals. Again, if you're on Coumadin, watch out for the vegetables with high vitamin K. I should probably back up and explain why you might want to limit vitamin K when you're on blood thinners like Coumadin or warfarin. Vitamin K helps your blood to clot, in other words, to thicken, so you will stop bleeding when you get cut. So it's crucial and life-saving in that regard. But many people are on blood thinners because of the narrowed arteries that could create a situation where a flying clot might block that smaller opening in the artery and slow down or stop the flow of blood. So vitamin K helps clotting, which would not be good if you have a narrowed artery and need to avoid clots. That's why your doctor might say you should not eat foods with vitamin K, like kale, spinach, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, etc. There is a list of foods that you should get from your doctor, or I can send you a list if you'd like to email me for the list that is put out by the American Dietetic Association. All of the dark green vegetables have lots of fiber as well, and just about all of the above vegetables have lots of antioxidants. In general, the deeper the color in either of these two categories, the denser it is in vitamins. So if you're doing a stir fry, you can substitute broccoli, spinach, kale, peppers, bok choy, pea pods, or most of the cabbages for any other recipe ingredients. Now, substituting for different cooking methods can be a little trickier. For example, in the case of rice, you can boil it, steam it, or bake it, but the amount of water you add will vary with each method. With fish, you can steam it, broil it, bake it, fry it, or sushi it. And when it comes to sushi, the old saying, "Don't try this at home," applies. And it might be best not to change cooking methods until you can tell whether or not it is safely cooked. There are some exceptions, because bacteria like E. coli can come from the soil, so washing vegetables thoroughly is always a good idea. If you're stir-frying vegetables, the E. coli will be killed by the heat. If you're throwing the lettuce into a salad, then it needs to be washed thoroughly. Having said that, we all know that it's possible for produce to spoil or grow mold. Training yourself to do the sniff test might be a good idea with most produce and certainly dairy products. In conclusion, all of this is to say that anyone can become confident switching ingredients around. It's a matter of practicing and keeping an eye out for what the good cooks do, either on TV, in restaurants, or in cookbooks. And if you're still not convinced that you can pull this off, I am now offering to record short videos of a recipe that I can put together according to your preferences. So you can just go to my contact page, Healing Outside the Box, and tap the Nutrition Services page. Before I finish up here, I'll give you an example. Let's practice looking at a recipe with an eagle eye. I'll give you this example. Pasta salad with roasted carrots in a sunflower seed dressing. Now, this is a cold pasta salad, but the foodie police will not come to your door if you serve it warm. You can also serve it at room temperature, because in this recipe, there is no meat or fish to grow out pathogenic bacteria. But the same rules apply about washing your vegetables thoroughly. Now, this recipe that I have has a specific instruction telling you that if you buy salted sunflower seeds, you should reduce the salt in the recipe. Basically, you can always reduce the salt in a recipe, unless you're making cheese, which I'm guessing you're not. Now, this recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of salt in the vegetable pasta mixture and 1/2 teaspoon of salt in the salad dressing. That's a decent amount of salt. It is for 4 to 6 servings, FYI, but that's still a lot. How much, you ask? Well, 1 teaspoon of salt is 6,000 milligrams of sodium chloride. Not sodium, sodium chloride. So, out of the 6,000 milligrams, 2,325 milligrams are sodium. Having said that, the daily recommendation for total sodium is 2,300 for the whole day. So they're recommending you have only 1 teaspoon of salt for the whole day. Again, it's multiple servings, but that's still a lot of salt. But you also have the 1/2 teaspoon in the salad dressing. Total sodium is 3,487 milligrams. One portion, if you're feeding 4, is still 872 milligrams of sodium. That's a decent amount. So what I would do, if on a sodium-restricted diet, is to use 1/2 teaspoon of salt in the pasta vegetable mixture instead of the 1 teaspoon. The recipe calls for 2 bunches of carrots and roasting them. But once again, this is a cold pasta salad, so you can do anything you want. A lot of people like to use cherry tomatoes and cucumbers. That would be fine. You could roast peppers, which a lot of people like in their salads. Basically, whatever floats your boat. Now, they also call for 3 tablespoons of grated Parmesan cheese in the dressing. Again, a high-fat, high-salt ingredient. You could just eliminate it. The dressing calls for the juice of 1/2 a lemon, but you could use lime. You could use the juice from frozen raspberries. My mother liked to add fresh strawberries to her cold pasta salads. So basically whatever you'd like. Okay, so you're getting the idea, I'm sure. You can reach me in the comments section or email me on my podcast page, which is healingoutsidethebox.com. And, unless you're Alice in Wonderland, don't eat the backyard mushrooms. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.